Hello, and welcome to the Postcode Revolution podcast, talking the future on your doorstep. I'm Jack Cooper, founder and director of Postcode Revolution, an organisation focused on community building and emergency climate adaptation in the neighbourhoods we call home. This series explores the ideas of Postcode Revolution to change the world of business as usual. With me today is Adam Lent. Adam is catalysing a new movement for radical change in public services called #DoWith. The movement calls for a fundamental shift in the way public services work, away from doing things to people and communities and towards doing things with them instead. For the last 20 years, he has worked on public sector innovation and public service reform. He is former chief executive of New Local, a think tank and peer learning network, and currently works as a senior consultant for the independent charitable organisation, the King's Fund. This was a fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Adam.
Hello, very pleased to be here.
In an interview with the New Statesman, you described your career high as co-authoring the community paradigm with Jessica Studdert while at New Local. Could you describe your paradigm-based approach?
The sort of core idea behind it was this idea of paradigm shift, which is the idea that the way we work, the way we do things, the way we live our lives, the way we sort of run our careers and carry out our roles in our employment, these things are shaped by sort of foundational ideas. And those foundational ideas sometimes are so deeply buried that they're almost unspoken. We don't even really notice they exist anymore. You can almost explain them as like ways of seeing or ways of being, rather, in the world. And that real change, real shifts happen when those foundational principles, those paradigms, no longer work and begin to fail. And so what we did in the community paradigm was identify sort of three paradigms which have shaped public services and the public sector over many years. The first of those is what we called the civic paradigm, which has really been around for centuries and is really seeing public service as something that is done by sort of voluntary association or by charities or by mutual or mutualist organizations. And that was the model really for many, many centuries. Then really once we get into the early 20th century, and certainly once we get into the period after the Second World War, that paradigm is replaced by what we call the state paradigm, which sees public services as something which is essentially provided by government and tends to be very top down, tends to be focused very much on the expertise of the public servant, and is quite sort of technical and bureaucratic and processy in nature. Processy is not an official word. I've just sort of created that word, but I think you know what I mean. And then from the 80s, after Margaret Thatcher came to power, there was an attempt to try and replace that state paradigm with a market paradigm, which sees public services as being something which really should be run much more like a free market or run according to the rules of business, basically. And a whole bunch of policies and approaches were brought in by the Thatcher governments and governments afterwards to try and make public services work more like a market. Now, I mean, the reality is that never fully replaced the state paradigm. The state paradigm remained very strong. Though what we actually have now is a bit of a strange hybrid of a state paradigm and a market paradigm. And what we were arguing in the community paradigm was that those paradigms are now failing quite seriously. And the new paradigm is seeing public services which are delivered very much in collaboration with communities. In some ways, take some of the best aspects of the civic paradigm, and there were real problems with the way the civic paradigm worked, but take some of the really best aspects of that and sort of combine that with public services as they currently work to become much more community led, much more about allowing the community to have a big voice and influence over the delivery of public services, but also to deliver public services in deep collaboration with community organizations, community energy, community assets, etc. And I think what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is actually the shift is beginning to happen, but it is slow and there's an enormous amount of resistance in the system.
Thank you for describing that so well, and it's so relevant to postcode revolution in the sense of revolution as a paradigm shift, and it is in effect a community paradigm shift that I've been talking about and trying to do. So it's amazing that you theorized this, were able to describe this back in 2019, and how much pushback has there been from people in the positions of power in the state and
Mm.
market paradigm hybrid that is existing today?
Well, I think the main resistance is really about inertia. I think people become very attached to existing paradigms. There's a sort of status quo bias, and so there's a resistance to change. And that is very strong in the public sector. What I would describe now, I describe more as a do-to mentality. That our job in public services or in the state more generally is to do things to people, and the community paradigm and other similar community power, as people now call it, and other similar approaches are really about doing things with people in a very sort of different way. But that do to mentality is very deeply ingrained in the culture of public sector. It's also bound up with a whole range of things like people's careers, their status, their sense of identity. So for example, if you look at something like, the NHS, the highest status people in the NHS, the people whose careers have advanced the most, have got there because they're really good at proving that they can do things to people, usually in a medicalized clinical sense. They don't get where they are by showing that they give patients a voice. They try and rethink their approach so that communities and families and individuals at the heart of the way they deliver medical services, they basically get where they are by getting accreditations and proving to their superiors that they're really good at doing things to people. So these things are very deeply inbred, and that's why there's always going to be enormous amounts of resistance. And a lot of that is sort of unspoken, but I would say there's sort of two other big, much more sort of explicit forms of resistance. One is we haven't got enough money or we're too under pressure to make this sort of change. And I completely get that. People in public service now are under enormous amounts of pressure. They're incredibly busy, and it's very difficult to find the time and the bandwidth to do things differently. But, my response to that is, well, it is happening in some places. So clearly some people are able to do it. And the other thing is actually, you can't afford not to do this. The challenges are so big now because of a deep crisis that I think exists in our society. And the resources you have available are so limited, the money basically and the staff, that you've got to find ways to augment that resource with all the assets and energy and insight that exists outside the institution in the community. And for me, that's the strongest argument. And most people, when you say that, recognize, well, yeah, I can see that we can't continue the way we are, just trying to meet these massive social crises with very limited resource. We have to find other ways of bringing in energy and assets from elsewhere. The second resistance you get, which comes much more from politicians, is I've been elected to make decisions on behalf of the voters. So it would be, an abdication of my responsibility for me to go out and bring the community's voice in or hand power and resource over to them. And I think that's a sort of dying argument, but it's still there and it's just plain wrong. And it was an argument that was developed when, most people were illiterate. It was very difficult to communicate over long distances, travel. It took, weeks to travel across the country. We don't live in that world anymore. There's all sorts of ways of communicating, bringing people together and getting really informed, sensible decisions out of working with people in the community.
Yeah, I agree. And in the context of environmentalism and climate crisis, a lot of this community paradigm thinking has been intertwined with it. XR and the Citizens Assembly. Why do you think the environmental movement have connected with this?
I think, well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I know why I think it's important, put it that way. Maybe other people, in the environmental movement sort of share this view. I mean, for me, it's partly about mitigating the damage that's being done to the environment, which goes well beyond climate, by the way, and carbon.
Mm.
But it's also about adapting to the crisis which is already underway. And from the mitigation point of view, I think it is about moving away from globalization and global trade and the inevitable damage that has done to the environment. I also think there is a sense in which that sort of consumerist culture and an economy built around consumerism is one of the fundamental underlying things that is damaging the environment. And I sort of feel that a move back to a focus on local community, on human connection, on the fulfillment that comes from being part of a local community is an alternative to that sort of consumerist mindset. But then the second thing I think is about adaptation. And, the crisis is here, the environmental crisis. My own view is that it's going to get worse and worse. I don't think we're about to solve the problems that we've created, despite some of the sort of optimistic stuff you see coming out of certain quarters. I think things are going to get very, very tough. And we need to build resilience to that crisis. We need to find solutions that are not reliant on things like big business and the big state, because the resource that used to be available to fund the big state and big business, that's going to decline as the environmental crisis has more and more damage on the economy. So we've got to build resilience, and you build resilience at the local level, and you build it through creating social capital, building human connection, building trust, building a sense, really importantly, building a sense that you have efficacy as a collective, as a group, to change the world and make things better and respond to challenges and crisis. And we need to find solutions at the local level that are our own solutions, that generated out of the community, that don't rely on big business or the big state to provide solutions for us. So, there's a very interesting point now we've reached where actually the route to mitigation is actually the same as the route to adaptation. It's all about localization, strengthening communities, building a sense of local self-efficacy, building resilience, and creating the economies and the polities at a local level that will support that.
What projects are happening right now?
There are lots of new strands of thought and activism beginning to emerge from the grassroots. And you can see that in the thinking around what might be economies not based on growth and destruction of nature. You can see lots of communities around the country, particularly more working class, poorer communities, that are now self-organizing and beginning to do stuff for themselves and try and make their life better. You go and look at a place like Lawrence Weston on the outskirts of Bristol, Union Street in Plymouth, amazing stuff happening in Hastings under an organization called Hastings Commons, amazing stuff in Colville, in Hartlepool. These things don't make the headlines, but there really is the beginnings of a movement amongst working class communities to start seizing control and making life better for themselves and the places they live. There's some really amazing, incredible innovations happening on the front line of public services to really empower communities. You look at the work that's happening in Fleetwood, which for about 10 years now has been reinventing health services and public services. So the community is absolutely the heart of it. You've got all these sort of rewilding, regenerative stuff happening around nature. And for me, they all share a really common principle, which is they're all about challenging the hierarchy of wealth and power that dominates our society and building a different world on the ground. And for me, the next step is to try and start bringing these strands together identifying the commonalities between them, turning them into more than the sum of their parts, so they become a real wave, a movement of change. And that is how I believe we're going to start adapting to the climate and environmental crisis. We're going to start mitigating it, but we're also going to start creating a different world that isn't dominated by excessive fascistic power, isn't dominated by militarism and nuclear power. It may take decades. I'm sure it will take decades, but the beginnings of the seeds of that different world are happening now. We just have to work to enable and encourage them.
Yeah, there are many things happening which are very exciting, very innovative, very inspiring, and are typically not in the newspapers. Seek them out and seek Postcode Revolution out and start building community where you are and check out the toolkit. Start connecting with your neighbours, creating community, and acting on climate and nature. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Adam.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast was produced and edited by me, Jack Cooper, with music by Lisa Mira and Boomtown. Please rate and share the podcast if you enjoyed it, and if you'd like to support Postcode Revolution and dive deeper into these ideas, you can become a supporter for £5 a month on Patreon and access the extended cut of this conversation and all the others in the series. Thanks for listening. See you in 2 weeks.